You faced the shadow, you did the work, you healed the wounds. And now you feel empty. There's no drive, no spark, no motivation left in you. But the most confusing part, you can't explain why. You should feel better, shouldn't you? Yet, instead, you're left wondering if maybe you broke something deep inside. What if this isn't failure at all? What if this strange silence is actually something else's signal that your soul has simply stopped performing? There's something few people talk about when it comes to shadow work. Something Carl Jung understood well, but rarely put into plain words. When you finish unearthing the depths of your unconscious, when you've dug up all the buried shame, unmet needs, and childhood wounds, you don't simply feel better. You feel different, fundamentally, deeply, and sometimes unsettlingly. Different, Jung once wrote, "The collapse of the persona is often mistaken for depression." He recognized something that much of modern psychology still tends to overlook. When you've truly faced your shadow, when you've integrated those exiled parts of yourself, your motivational system doesn't just shift, it dissolves. And that dissolution is not a sign of something going wrong. It is the beginning of transformation. Consider this. For years, maybe even most of your life, you've been fueled by unconscious forces. The need to be accepted, the fear of rejection, the longing to prove your value, the deep terror of not being enough. These weren't decisions. They were defense mechanisms, survival programs running silently in the background. They pushed you forward, kept you busy, made you achieve, hustle, succeed. But when you engage in deep shadow work, it doesn't just heal the wounds it reveals. It's the very engine behind your behaviors. You suddenly begin to see how much of your ambition was actually fear in disguise. How much of your drive was really just pain, wearing the costume of purpose. And when that system stops operating, when those hidden drivers go quiet, you don't just lose momentum. You lose the only reasons you ever had for being driven in the first place. This is what Jung called the necessary dissolution before rebirth. A falling apart before something new can emerge. But what no one tells you is how strange and still it feels in the space between who you once were and who you are yet to become. Let me share Sarah's story with you. It's not her real name, but everything else is true. Sarah spent 2 intense years in therapy after a painful breakup shattered the emotional patterns she'd carried since childhood. She went DP, MDR, inner child work, parts work, full shadow integration. She faced it all with courage and clarity. By the end of those 2 years, she was truly healed. The anxiety that had haunted her for decades had faded. The compulsion to please everyone had vanished. The old fear of being alone was replaced by an honest, grounded self-companionship. But when she returned to her career in marketing, something she had once thrived in, something felt off. Not wrong in a dramatic way. Just strangely empty. Campaigns that used to excite her felt meaningless. The client meetings that once energized her left her feeling hollow. The promotions she'd been chasing for years suddenly seemed like elaborate distractions from something she couldn't name. "I used to wake up every morning with a fire in my belly," she told me. Even if it was anxiety, even if it was fear, it was fuel. It gave me motion, something to grasp onto. Now she says, "I wake up and feel ... nothing. Like I'm waiting for instructions from a voice that isn't speaking or has gone silent." This is what Jung called the Negredo phase of psychological alchemy, one of the most mysterious and misunderstood stages of inner transformation. It's the necessary darkness, the inner void, the quiet disintegration that must unfold before new life can ever emerge. In medieval alchemy, Negredo was known as the blackening, the symbolic death of the old self, the crumbling of the known form, before any rebirth or enlightenment could take place. But here's what makes it particularly disorienting in our modern world. We've been conditioned to believe that healing always feels good, that growth follows a straight upward line, that progress is something you can measure in checklists, milestones, or happiness charts. We're told that transformation should feel like clarity, like finally arriving. So, when instead it feels like confusion, exhaustion, or detachment, we assume something has gone terribly wrong. We expect shadow work to work like taking medicine. You're in pain. You take something and the pain goes away. But in reality, shadow work often functions more like surgery. The operation may be successful, but the recovery? It's unpredictable, it's long. It's often filled with disorientation, vulnerability, and a strange sense of emptiness. You never anticipated. During this phase, you might find yourself unable to care about things that once felt essential. Career ambitions that used to ignite your passion may now seem arbitrary or empty. Relationships that once brought excitement may suddenly feel like routines you're performing rather than deeply living. Even hobbies or rituals that once sparked joy may now feel oddly mechanical or disconnected. But this isn't clinical depression. You're not hopeless. You're not broken. You're not even dysfunctional in the usual sense. You're simply not motivated by the same things anymore. And without those familiar carrots to chase, or those hidden sticks of fear pushing you forward, you suddenly don't know what to do next. Jung understood this moment not as a failure, but as a profound sign that your psyche is undergoing a deep and necessary reorganization. Your constructed identity, your idea of who you were, has stepped aside. But your deeper, more authentic self hasn't fully come forward yet. So you're caught in between, the space after the old. Self dissolves, but before the new one arrives. This is what mystics called the liminal space, the threshold, the void between one way of being and another. It's not a mistake. It's not a flaw. It's part of the process. Pause here and take a breath. Is this what you've been carrying all along? That low-level pressure telling you that you should feel more purposeful, more alive, more driven than you currently do? The truth is, your psyche is protecting you from going backward. It's resisting the call to re-engage with motivations that were never truly yours. You're never truly aligned with who you really are. But at the same time, it hasn't yet revealed what will guide you forward. This isn't laziness. This isn't failure. This isn't even stagnation. This is your soul taking a sacred pause, a deliberate stillness before the next phase of your becoming. In traditional cultures, this in-between void was not pathologized. It was honored as a crucial and sacred part of spiritual development. Vision quests, his dark nights of the soul, rites of initiation throughout history, all of these have acknowledged a universal truth. Real growth often demands a season of dissolution, of disorientation, of profound emptiness, time when you don't know who you are anymore or where you're headed. But we live in a culture that pathologizes stillness, that sees mystery as a problem to be solved, that rushes to medicate discomfort instead of listening to what it might be pointing toward. We try to fix what may not be broken at all, simply because it doesn't fit our narrow definition of progress. Jung warned us clearly and powerfully that if we attempt to skip this phase, if we rush headlong back into action before true transformation has completed its course, we're not evolving. We're just decorating the same house with new furniture. We may look different on the outside, more enlightened, more healed, but internally, we're still running the exact same unconscious programs that led us into shadow work in the first place. And here's the truth that has the power to shift everything. The silence you feel right now is not a sign of failure. It's nor collapse. It is a sacred pause. It is your soul taking a breath before rebirth. Every motivation you've ever had that stemmed from fear, societal pressure, the need to prove yourself, the desperation to avoid pain, all of it has fallen away. It's not because something is broken, but because you have simply outgrown those old stories. Your soul is quite literally refusing to play that game anymore. Jung expressed it simply and beautifully. You are not failing. You are in between. Pause and reflect. What did motivation used to mean to you, really? Be honest, not the version you tell your boss or put on a vision board, but in the quiet moments when you're truly with yourself.
How much of your ambition was fueled by a desire to be accepted, to be admired?
How much came from fear?
Fear of being irrelevant, of being unloved, of not being good enough.
How much of it was just highly functional anxiety, wearing the polished mask of productivity? This is the true nature of shadow work. When you go deep, when you actually confront and integrate those buried patterns, you don't just heal, You begin to dismantle the illusion that your value is tied to your performance. Stop believing that love must be earned. Let go of the myth that your worth increases with every task you complete or every goal you achieve. And when those beliefs dissolve, it doesn't disappear because you're lazy. It vanishes because it was never rooted in truth. This is what Jung meant by the death of the persona. The persona is the mask you've worn to function in society, an identity carefully crafted to meet expectations, secure approval, avoid pain. But it's not the real you. It's who you believed you had to be to survive in a world that rewards performance over presence. It draws a stark line between your authentic self and the role you've been unconsciously performing. And once you see that difference, you can never unsee it. Here lies the challenge. Most of your life, your career, your friendships, your goals, your very sense of purpose was built around that performed self, around a version of you that once served you but is now crumbling. What happens when that version of you dies? You haven't yet uncovered what lies beneath. You feel lost, unmotivated. Because real motivation, the kind that lasts, can only come from alignment with truth. And that truth, right now, is still finding its shape. Let me share another story. This one's about David, a successful architect, who spent 3 years working through childhood trauma and attachment wounds. The healing process was profound. He felt more at peace than he ever had in his life. For the first time, his inner world was calm, still almost unfamiliar in its quietness. But when he tried to return to his work designing buildings, managing high-stakes projects, climbing the ever-demanding corporate ladder, something felt undeniably off. It was like wearing clothes that didn't fit anymore, not uncomfortable in. The obvious sense, just ... wrong. As if he was stepping into a role he had rehearsed for years, only to realize the script no longer made sense. Like he was playing a character in a play he no longer believed in. I used to be so driven, he told me. I'd work 60-hour weeks and love it. I had 5-year plans, 10-year visions. I knew exactly what I wanted and exactly how to get there. It gave me focus. It gave me purpose. But now, when he looked at those same goals he had once treated like sacred destinations, they felt lifeless, hollow. It's like they belonged to someone else, he said, a quiet sadness in his voice. At first, David thought he was depressed. He went to his doctor, considered medication, even wondered if maybe he hadn't healed as fully as he believed. Was something wrong? Was this backsliding? Even briefly questioned whether he needed more therapy. But what he was experiencing wasn't depression. It didn't come with the hopelessness, numbness, or paralysis he once knew. This wasn't a return to pain. It was the unfamiliar space that opens up when pain is no longer running the show. It was the natural result of profound inner change. His old motivations, the deep, often invisible forces that had fueled him for years, had dissolved. The need to prove his worth through relentless achievement, to win his father's approval by succeeding, to shield himself from the sting of perceived failure, those forces were gone. Not forgotten, but integrated. It's not pushed away, but met and resolved through shadow work. Those motivations, once powerful engines, had lost their grip. But here's the catch. His new motivations, the ones that would arise not from old wounds, but from his true, authentic self, hadn't appeared yet. The old fuel was gone, and the new spark had yet to arrive. He was in between. This is the tipping point Jung talked about. The edge where the old way no longer works. The new way hasn't yet revealed itself. And at that edge, something radical becomes clear. True motivation sustainable. Nourishing, soul-aligned motivation doesn't come from compulsion. Doesn't come from urgency, pressure, or the fear of failure. It comes from truth. When you're driven by fear, you can push yourself to incredible limits. Fear is a powerful fuel that can get you up before dawn, keep you grinding long after others stop, and drive you to reach things you once thought impossible. Fear will make you hustle. It will keep you moving. But fear-based motivation always comes with a cost, and it has an expiration date. Eventually, you either burn out completely or you heal. And when healing comes when the fear no longer controls, You're left standing still, wondering what's next. That stillness isn't failure. That emptiness isn't a void to be filled as quickly as possible. It's a doorway, a pause, space your psyche is creating intentionally to make room for something new, something real. If any of this resonates with you, if it strikes a chord you can't quite name, keep going. What comes next might feel like a mirror. Jung believed that the self, your deeper, its unshakable, most authentic essence, doesn't scream to be heard. It doesn't beg, doesn't dramatize or create chaos to capture your attention. The self whispers, it nudges gently, speaks in quiet invitations, soft urgings that are easy to miss if your life is filled with noise. But if you're constantly reacting to deadlines, to demands, to internal pressure and old fear loops, how could you possibly hear the whisper? How could you feel the nudge? How could you recognize the invitation? That's why the void is sacred. That's why the silence is not something to be escaped, but embraced. That's why losing your old motivation isn't failure. It's preparation. Your soul is creating the conditions carefully, patiently for you to finally hear what it's been trying to tell you all along. Here's what nobody tells you about the other side of this void, about what happens when you stop fighting the silence and start listening. To what it's trying to teach you, when new motivation emerges, it feels completely different. It's not laced with anxiety, doesn't carry the sharp edges of urgency or the pressure to prove something to the world or to yourself. It doesn't come from a place of lack, fear, or comparison. Instead, it arrives softly, almost imperceptibly at first. It's calm, it's grounded, it's steady, unwavering in a way that feels more like remembering than striving. And above all else, it's undeniable. It's the difference between artificial light and sunlight. Both help you see, but one is harsh and draining, while the other is warm, life-giving, and deeply nourishing. One flickers, the other glows. One forces clarity, the other gently reveals what was already there. This is what Jung referred to as the emergence of the self with a capital S, not the small self. The ego that's always hungry for recognition, that craves status and validation, that chases metrics and compares endlessly. But the deeper self, the part of you that is already whole, it's the self that knows you are already worthy, that you belong, even without performance. When the self starts to guide you, your relationship to action transforms. You no longer hustle from a sense of insufficiency. Respond to life's invitations with trust. You stop chasing opportunities as though they're scarce or might vanish. Instead, you recognize them intuitively with the calm certainty of someone who knows they are allowed to be at the table. You no longer force passion like you're trying to jumpstart a dead battery. You follow quiet threads of curiosity, allowing them to lead you where they will without judgment or agenda. You don't create to fill a void, trying desperately to escape silence. You create because there's something overflowing inside you, a fullness that needs to be expressed, a sense that what's within you is ripened and is ready to be shared, not to prove your worth, but because it simply wants to come into form. Let me tell you what this looked like for David, the architect. I mentioned earlier, after nearly a year of feeling flat, uninspired, and uncertain, after months of questioning whether the deep inner work had somehow broken something inside him, something began to shift. But it didn't come as a grand awakening. There was no flash of insight or lightning bolt of purpose. It arrived more like the gradual return of morning light. A slow, almost imperceptible brightening, so subtle that at first he hardly noticed. But one day he realized he no longer felt lost. He didn't feel fully found yet either, but something was stirring. He started taking long, aimless walks, not for cardio, not as part of a morning routine optimized for productivity, not to multitask with podcasts or calls, just walking, for its own sake, moving his body because it felt good, being outside because it felt right. There was no goal, no data, no outcome to track, just being, just noticing. And on one of these quiet walks, he passed an old building he had driven by countless times before. It had always been there, neglected and forgotten, its windows boarded up, its exterior crumbling. But that day something was different. The building seemed to speak, not with words, but with presence. Its decay held beauty. Its work carried a strange kind of dignity. Its forgotten form whispered stories no one had listened to in years. Instead of brushing off the feeling, or analyzing why he felt drawn to this place, or turning it into another project or a professional angle, he simply allowed himself to feel. He sat with the building, began visiting it regularly, not to fix it, but to witness it, to understand it, to be in relationship with it. He started sketching again, not blueprints, not formal plans, not monetizable designs, just impressions, fragments, what the space made him feel, what it might have been, what it might become, what story it seemed to want to tell in its own quiet way. He wasn't doing this for anything. He was doing it because something inside him finally wanted to. This wasn't driven by career goals or financial incentives. It wasn't about ambition or achievement. It wasn't motivated by the desire to prove his worth to anyone, or to impress future clients, or to build a dazzling portfolio. Instead, it was motivated by something else entirely, something deeper, quieter, and far more honest. By curiosity, by beauty, by a mysterious sense of alignment, of rightness, that he couldn't explain and no longer felt the need to. It wasn't logical, and it didn't have to be. The building had something to say, and for the first time, he had the stillness, the patience, and the capacity to truly listen. He returned to that same spot again and again. Day after day, week after week, he sat quietly with the old structure that most people walked past without a second glance. He brought his sketchbook, not to create anything purposeful, but just to draw, to be present, to witness. It became a kind of meditation, a dialogue between presence and possibility. The act of observing became sacred. No deadlines, no deliverables, just being. Just noticing what stirred inside him in response. And then, without warning and without him chasing it, an idea began to emerge, gently, organically. It didn't arrive as a strategy or a plan. It came as a vision. A soft, persistent what if that lingered, sense of potential that felt more real, more alive than anything he'd worked on in years. It wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention. But it kept returning. Each time he visited, it became clearer. Something wanted to take shape. Eventually, his quiet fascination led to a conversation with the building's owner. That one conversation opened the door to another, then another. What began as silent curiosity transformed without force into a living project. A restoration unlike any he had done before. One that wasn't about erasing the past, but honoring it. Not about imposing a vision, but allowing one to reveal itself. It was collaboration not with a client, but with the soul of the place itself. Even more remarkably, it wasn't just about architecture anymore. This project began drawing in the surrounding community. Neighbors who had once felt disconnected began showing up with stories and memories. Artists offered to contribute. Children played nearby again. A forgotten space slowly came back to life. And as it did, so did he. This was no longer just a creative detour. It was a shift. A doorway into a completely new chapter of his work. A chapter that felt aligned not with who he had been, but with who he was quietly, inevitably becoming. But here's the most important insight. None of this would have happened if he had. I tried to force his old motivation to return. If he had pushed through the discomfort, ignored the silence, and returned to his former mode of productivity, he would have missed it all. The whisper, the invitation, the unfolding. He would have driven past that building another 1,000 times. Without ever truly seeing it, he would have continued designing sleek, impressive structures that looked perfect on paper but felt empty inside. He might have stayed successful, yes, but quietly starved. Productive, but purposeless. The self doesn't roar. It hums. It doesn't scream for attention or shove its way into your plans. It whispers, offering gentle invitations, soft inner nudges. It doesn't create panic or urgency. It creates resonance. A vibration you feel in your chest more than in your mind. And when you learn to hear that hum, when you start to recognize that subtle frequency and trust its guidance, everything changes. Motivation no longer feels like a battle between willpower and resistance. It becomes an unfolding, a movement from within. You begin to write not to gain approval, not to chase metrics or validate your intelligence, but because something in you needs to be expressed. You create not because you want to be seen as creative, but because beauty is moving through you and asking to be shaped. You love not out of fear of being alone, but because connection is your true nature. You work not to validate your worth through productivity, but because the work itself calls you, draws you, becomes part of your becoming. This is what Jung meant when he spoke about living symbolically. He wasn't referring to escapism, fantasy, or wishful thinking. He wasn't pointing to spiritual bypassing or disconnection from reality. He meant living in conscious connection to the deeper patterns of your psyche, to the quiet poetry beneath the noise, to the meaningful coincidences, the synchronicities that help guide us when logic can't. The synchronicities that reveal how your individual story fits into the larger story of existence, how your personal healing serves something bigger than your personal comfort. These subtle moments, so easy to miss if you're moving too fast, carry powerful reminders that your journey is not isolated. It's part of a greater unfolding. Every step you take toward wholeness sends quiet, ripples into the lives of those around you, and when you're motivated by the self rather than the ego, the entire experience of living transforms. Work becomes devotion rather than obligation. No longer a means to prove your value, it becomes a sacred offering. Something you give because it feels aligned with your deepest truth. Relationships shift too, evolve from unconscious cravings for validation into conscious, intentional choices made from clarity and mutual respect. You no longer seek connection to fill a void, you choose it because it reflects your fullness. Creativity becomes a form of expression rather than a performance to be evaluated. You're not trying to impress anyone, you're simply translating something alive within you into form. Rest becomes nourishment, not something to be earned after you've exhausted yourself. You begin to understand that stillness is part of growth, not an interruption of it. Boundaries, once guilt-inducing, now feel like essential acts of self-care. Saying no longer means you're selfish, means you're listening to your own needs with compassion and respect. And here's the paradox that would have shocked your old self. This gentler motivation, this quiet soul-led energy often leads to more meaningful outcomes than the frantic drive that came before. Why? Because it's sustainable. Because it comes from authenticity rather than image. Because it flows from who you actually are, not from who you've been taught to be. Arises from inner fullness, not from a desperate hunger to be seen, loved, or validated. It stems from love rather than fear, truth rather than compulsion. There's a journaling prompt I want to offer you. Here's something deceptively simple, but deeply revealing. A practice that might help you begin to distinguish between ego-based motivation and self-based guidance in your own life. It might help you pause long enough to notice which voice is actually speaking when you're moved to act or when you feel strangely stuck. Take a moment. Grab a piece of paper. At the top, write down 3 things you believe you should feel motivated about right now. Not necessarily what you want, but what you think you ought to care about: projects, ambitions, roles, or goals you assume you're supposed to chase. Then ask yourself honestly, where does this should come from? Whose expectations are shaping it? Whose voice echoes in your mind when you think about these things? Is it your parents, your peers, your culture? Who would be disappointed if you stopped caring about this? What fear is driving this desire? A part of you feels like it has something to prove. Now, on another part of the page, write down 3 things that you feel quietly drawn to. Not the flashy logical goals, but the subtle pulls. Small, tender, sparks that make no strategic sense, yet feel meaningful. It could be something creative, something restful, something childlike, or something wild. Ask yourself, what would it feel like to follow this pull without explaining it to anyone? Without turning it into a brand or a breakthrough? What would it feel like to trust that your joy is reason enough? The contrast between those 2 lists might reveal more than you expect. It might illuminate the difference between motivation born from fear and movement born from truth, between the drive that exhausts you and the draw that nourishes you, between the anxious voice of your wounded ego and the steady whisper of your authentic self. Sarah. The woman I mentioned earlier discovered through this exact process that her long-standing motivation in the field of marketing, a career she had mastered, was rooted more in fear than passion. Her constant striving to succeed, to prove her value, to meet external expectations, had buried something much more genuine. Underneath it all was a tender, persistent longing to work with children. Not because she thought she should, not because it made sense on paper, not because it offered prestige or solved anything on the surface, but because something within her lit up in their presence. Something vital stirred. A part of her came, alive and ancient. Intuitive knowing that had been quietly waiting beneath years of conditioning. It wasn't about fixing children or saving them. It was about being with them, witnessing them, learning from them. Something about their honesty, their imagination, their freedom reminded her of who she really was before the world told her who to be. It took her 2 years to make the transition from marketing executive to elementary school teacher. 2 long, uncertain years of choosing to follow curiosity over clarity, of leaning into trust instead of trying to control the outcome, of moving forward in small, quiet steps toward what felt true, instead of leaping toward what appeared impressive. On the surface, her friends thought she was reckless, maybe even delusional. Her family raised their eyebrows, whispering concerns about the inevitable pay cut and the loss of status. Her own logical mind kept presenting arguments carefully reasoned, objections, endless what-ifs. But despite all of that, her soul began to sing again, softly at first, then louder. It was a melody she hadn't heard in decades. So here's what I want you to understand. You didn't lose your motivation. You simply outgrew the reasons that once pushed you. Those external motivators, the deadlines, the achievements, the praise no longer resonate because you've evolved. And this right here is not some consolation prize or a sign that you failed. This isn't you settling for less. This is you graduating to a deeper, more meaningful way of living. This is your psyche refusing, utterly refusing to let you continue performing when authenticity is finally within reach. The silence you've been afraid of, that uncomfortable stillness, that's not emptiness. That's the sacred space where your truest self has been waiting patiently, gently, all along. The void you've been trying so desperately to fill isn't a flaw, it's a clearing. A space being carved out inside you for something real, something sustainable, something that reflects who you are rather than who you've been told to be. Something more genuinely you than anything you've experienced before. Jung never promised this path would be easy. He didn't describe individuation, the profound process of becoming who you truly are, as comfortable or convenient. He understood it would require walking through the valley of not knowing, through the strange terrain where certainty dissolves, through the desert of not feeling, where old emotions no longer fuel you and new ones haven't yet arrived. He knew it would mean standing in the void, unsure of anything except the quiet insistence that the old way is no longer possible. But he also knew this. On the other side of that desert, there is an oasis. Not a mirage, not a fantasy you're chasing, but something real, solid, grounded. You've spent so long chasing the perfect life, the perfect career, the perfect relationship, the perfect version of yourself. But perfection was never the point. Perfection is brittle. What awaits you now is something true, something rooted, something alive. And most importantly, something that doesn't need to be perfect because it's real. The motivation that rises from this place is different. It doesn't burn you out because it's not sourced from emptiness. It doesn't leave you drained because it gives as much as it asks. It doesn't vanish when life gets difficult because it's not dependent on circumstances. It's rooted not in what you want to achieve, but in who you truly are and who you've been becoming all along. So if you're in the void right now, if you're waking up feeling numb, uninspired, unsure what you even care about anymore, I want to gently offer this. Maybe nothing is wrong. Maybe something is, in fact, profoundly right. Maybe you finally arrived at a point where your soul is strong enough to stop performing. Maybe your inner world is integrated enough to distinguish between inherited expectations and authentic desire. Maybe, just maybe, you've healed enough to pause, to wait, and to let real inspiration come in its own time, rather than sprinting forward on the fumes of urgency. Listen to the silence, not with your ears, but with your heart. What has it been trying to tell you all this time? What has it been protecting you from? What has it been preparing you for? Your old life, the one built on fear, on the relentless need to prove your worth, on the exhausting hunger for validation that life is over? You ended it. You did the brave, terrifying, sacred work to face your shadow so that you wouldn't have to live that way anymore. That version of you was a survivor. This version of you is something else. This isn't the end of your healing journey. This is the beginning of your authentic life. This is where the real adventure starts. The self you're becoming doesn't need motivation in the old sense. It doesn't crave the frantic push of deadlines or the hollow chase of external approval. Instead, it needs recognition, a gentle, wholehearted acknowledgement of who you already are beneath the layers of struggle and expectation. It needs trust. Not the kind born of certainty or control, but a quiet faith in the unfolding process of your own growth. It asks you to stop trying so hard to become someone else, to stop fighting against yourself, and to begin truly paying attention to the person who has been there all along, patiently waiting to be seen and embraced. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not failing. These fears, as loud and convincing as they may feel, do not tell the truth of your journey. You are exactly where you need to be for the next phase of your becoming to begin. And when it does begin, when that subtle, quiet hum of authentic motivation finally starts to emerge, you will understand why the silence was so necessary. You will come to see why the void had to be emptied, why the old had to fall away before it could be replaced by something new and real. This empty space is not a vacuum, but a fertile ground. It is the sacred pause where your soul gathers strength, where your true purpose patiently waits to reveal itself. You will realize that losing your old motivation wasn't a problem to be fixed or a failure to be feared. It was a profound gift. The gift of freedom. Freedom to finally let go of the worn-out reasons for pushing forward and to open yourself to discovering what you're really here for. What if this emptiness is actually an invitation? An invitation to listen more deeply, to rest more fully, and to trust more completely that your life's meaning is already within you, waiting quietly to be born anew. If this video resonated with something deep inside you, if it helped you put words to the experience you've been living through, I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Your story, your raw, honest journey through this void might be exactly the encouragement someone else needs to know they're not alone in this unsettling space. Sharing our experiences can turn isolation into connection, and that connection is a powerful form of healing. And if you want to continue exploring these deeper currents of psychology and soul, if you feel drawn to understanding the hidden patterns that shape our inner lives, make sure to subscribe. Because this conversation, this unfolding dialogue about what it truly means to become who we are is only just beginning. Remember, the void isn't the end of your story. It's the comma, the pause, the sacred breath between the life you've been living and the life you're meant to live. And that life, with all its mystery and possibility, it's worth every moment of the wait.